JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
Menachem Kaiser holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan and was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, and elsewhere. Please welcome Menachem Kaiser to the Hampton Synagogue.
Okay. Menachem, it's good to have you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, everyone.
So I'd like to start just by asking you to do a brief reading from the book. So why don't you set it up for us? What are you reading? And then take it away.
Sure. I was thinking either to read the beginning, in which case you don't need a setup, or... Okay. I'm going to start in the middle, and this is, for those who haven't read the book, this is when I find out there's been a series of errors. And so basically the central narrative of the book is I'm trying to reclaim property that belonged to my great-grandfather, and I invest a lot of time, and then I find out I've been spending all this time in the wrong building. About 2 years in, I found out the addresses had shifted, and had really heavily emotionally invested and met the residents of what turned out to be the incorrect building. So this is the section immediately following that discovery. Our origin stories are stories of where we come from, of where our parents and their parents come from, are riddled with errors. My grandmother's tombstone, to give a particularly blatant example, it's literally set in stone, says she was born in Oswiecim, but that's wrong. She grew up there, but was born in Rzeszów. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard about someone schlepping to Eastern Europe in order to trace their family story, to follow their memory map, only to discover that they'd had their entire lives a major or minor detail incorrect. The dates don't add up, the train routes are impossible, this address never existed, the ghetto had already been liquidated by then. It always feels surprising, bumping up against an error like this, but it shouldn't be. Family stories are poor preservers of history. They're fragmented, badly documented, warped by hearsay, conjecture, legend. Of course errors are going to creep in. This seems somehow wrong, even blasphemous, at odds with the private sacredness we impute to our origin stories. But most stories in most families aren't meant or relied on as preservation of hard information. They're meant and relied on as preservation of soft information, of sentiment, narrative, identity, of who someone was and, subsequently, who you are. It tells not a historical truth, but an emotional truth. I'd even argue that the built-in uncertainty, often unknowability, of details large and small is essential to the family mythos. We not only receive, but also participate in the story. On some level, we choose to believe. We ascribe. And the truth is that the details most easily corrupted are not details most people care all that much about anyway. What's the difference between number 12 and number 34 when either building is on a funny named street in a city you think about only in terms of dead Jews, in a country your family fled from? The mistake on my grandmother's tombstone. I've been bringing it up for years, but no one really cares. We're never going to change it. Because the difference between Babi having been born in Rzeszów and Babi having been born in Oswiecim is, to us, her children and grandchildren, who cannot properly pronounce or find on a map either city, negligible. And anyway, the errors are almost never discovered. The stories sit undisturbed and unprovoked, congeal into lore. No one is any the wiser. But what happens when the story is disturbed and provoked? When you seek to inspect or inhabit or engage with or build out parts of the story? Then the details do matter, especially the details you can touch and see and get up close to. Oswiecim and Rzeszów are more than 200 kilometers apart. The difference between Malchowskiego 12 and Malchowskiego 34 is, when you're asserting your rights as an heir, immense. Once you enter the story, the where and the what matter, because those are your access points. Those are the story's anchors, the myth containers. And to get that wrong, to chase down the wrong building or go to the wrong city, is to get your story wrong, to misfire, to suffer that private but sharp humiliation of having cared in the wrong direction. Or maybe even then it doesn't matter. Maybe the relationship between our stories and the places they describe is more tenuous. Maybe it's just a phantom force, just us insisting there's something there, pretending there's something, tricking ourselves into believing there's something. Earlier, I wrote how these sorts of stories can flex, can absorb, that they'll always have interesting and meaningful detours. But maybe that's not true. Maybe the detours in fact break the story a little, put into relief and reinforce the distance between you and whatever or whoever it is you think you're connecting with. Expose the fiction of sentimentalism, in other words. You thought this thing, this object, this building was meaningful, was special, but it turns out that no. It's just an object, just another building. It means nothing to you. You were creating all that in your head. And if that feeling of meaningfulness could be so wrong and misplaced, then what is that feeling worth? What is that feeling at all? Or maybe the sentimental history isn't erased but overwritten. Maybe it retains the narrative of having been meaningful. In Jewish law, when an object that is kadosh, holy, loses its holiness, like a Torah scroll that loses a couple of letters and thus becomes unusable, it does not then become spiritually meaningless, does not revert to a mundane object. Rather, it becomes an object that once was holy and must be treated accordingly. You cannot put it in the trash. You have to give it a proper burial.
Thank you. Let's go back and start at the very, very beginning. Right? I don't want to give too much away because we want them to buy the book. But at the very beginning, what motivated you to go back and try to reclaim your grandparents' building?
Well, those are two different parts. I actually was never motivated to go back. So I grew up, three of my four grandparents were Holocaust survivors. At the same time, I didn't really know any of their story. My grandfather, the first line of the book is, my father's father, Meyer Menachem Kaiser, who I'm named after, was born in April 1977. And so that was 8 years before I was born. So I didn't know him, but on top of that, I didn't know anything about him. So I didn't know anything about his time in the war. I didn't know anything about his family. All I knew is that everyone had been murdered. And so I grew up with a kind of ignorance about it, but the way I describe it, it was kind of a comfortable ignorance. So although it was definitely part of my legacy, it wasn't something that I felt all that compelled to investigate. So I moved to Lithuania when I was 25 for a Fulbright fellowship. I ended up studying the Vilna ghetto, so really nothing related to my family. My family was all from Poland. And then it was just like a funny, strange story. I ended up meeting a Hasidic guy in Vilnius who turned out to be the road manager for the Scorpions, the band, who were there on tour. And he invited me to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah. And once I went to Krakow, I didn't go for any familial reasons. And once I was there, I was like, I'm here anyways. Let's go see where my grandfather was from. And I also didn't grow up in a household where there was like a sense of responsibility to go back to Poland. There was really a sense of closure, as that my family had left, and like if you want to go back on a sort of like historical fact-finding mission, great, but it wasn't like a birthright to explore. But I went, and that was in 2011. I got an address from my father for a city in Sosnovich. No one in my family had ever been back. I went, I took photos of this building, I snuck inside, and at that point I really thought it would be a one-time thing. I thought it'd be like a memory pilgrimage, and I had sort of fulfilled my obligation, and would never really, what reason would there be to go back? Over the next few years, I did quite a bit of research in Poland, and I spent a lot of time there. And I met a lot of people and developed a network and a community, and I kept hearing about people reclaiming property. And I would mention this to my dad, and he's like, we have this building, we own this building, and I have all these documents, and he's like, you should look into it. And I was like, it doesn't matter, it's not worth anything, what's the point? But then finally my father got fed up with my laziness, and he faxed me all these documents when I was in Krakow, and that's when I would say it broke. And that's when I read these documents, and really for the first time in my life, I felt like I was meeting my grandfather. I did not know, and no one had ever told me, that for 30 years after the war, my grandfather had tried to reclaim this property. And again, because it was working against a complete blank of who my grandfather was, I saw like a lot of motivation and failure And I felt very moved by it. And that's why I said, I'm in a position where I could continue what he began and maybe succeed where he failed also, or maybe fail in the same way that he failed. But it felt like an interesting way to be in conversation with him. And so that's when I sat down, I got the number for a lawyer, and I began the reclamation process.
And then that's when the book starts, basically.
That's sort of the opening salvo.
So you already mentioned, running into the band manager for the Scorpions who got you to Rosh Hashanah in Krakow. So you already have a sense that this is not like a typical kind of, real estate expedition kind of story.
Is there such a thing as a typical real estate expedition story?
Maybe not, but this story feels particularly out there in that kind of way. Without giving too much away,
Sure.
Right? From that auspicious beginning, the story goes almost completely off the rails, as it were, and one strange thing after another keeps happening. Maybe you can pick out one or two of the most crazy events or crazy people that you met over the course of this journey, just to whet the appetite a little bit.
Are we getting to the treasure hunters?
If you want to.
So I think sort of the strangest thing that happened, and I'll try to keep this brief, is that I ended up, completely coincidentally, I ended up meeting a large subculture of treasure hunters in southwest Poland and Silesia. I went for a different reason. I was thinking about writing a novel at the time, and there was this very long, zany story about a golden train, and two treasure hunters claimed to have found the golden train. That was a train full of looted Nazi gold that treasure hunters had been looking for 40 years, and two guys claimed to have found it. It made international news. I was like, what's going on? I wanted to meet these guys, and I sat with them. And they took me, it's a lot to explain, but a short version is basically there was a Holocaust survivor who wrote a secret diary while in the camps, and this secret diary has become a kind of mythical text among the treasure hunter community. It turns out that the man who wrote that diary was not only related to me, but was in fact my grandfather's closest surviving relative. On account of this familial connection, I became a celebrity among the treasure hunter community. And was really embraced and brought into that world. So I would say that's sort of the strangest thing that happened here, where I sort of and I met. That's another narrative of the book is sort of my descent into the world of Polish treasure hunters.
There's a lot of research in the book also. You discuss lots of different subcultures and strange subgroups of people. You get involved with Nazi UFO conspiracy theories. You get involved with Nazi anti-gravity weapons and space stations and time travel and all this different type of stuff. And you talk about it with a certain degree of authority. So I'm wondering, how do you even begin to research this sort of stuff? How do you find this kind of stuff? And how do you research it to weave into a book?
Sure. So Rabbi Bronstein. Rabbi Bronstein is referring to is the most research-intensive chapter in the book by far is about conspiracy theories. And so to give you a little taste of the world I was entering, so this treasure hunter subculture is a large one. I would say easily over 100,000 in Poland, with sort of different subgroups in Germany and Czech Republic. It is all sort of centered around something called Project Riza. Project Riza is a series of 7 underground Nazi structures, commonly called tunnels, but they're much more than tunnels, that were built by mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. To give you a sense of what these things are, so there's 7 of them. None of them were completed, but the ones closer to completion are enormous. So it means square, I'm Canadian, so I use the metric system, so square kilometers. We're talking 20 meter or 60 feet high ceilings. It could be 200 meters, or that's, 600-700 feet long. So we're talking about underground Nazi, basically neighborhoods. And what makes them truly enigmatic is that there's virtually no primary documentation for them. And so we have no German records for what they were to be used for. And so, which is why, why that diary I mentioned before, written by this man named Avraham Kaiser, turned out to be such a special text because it's operating in the space where there's no other documentation. So his diary of working on these tunnels is held in such high esteem because of that reason. Now, when I was hanging out with these treasure hunters, they kept saying some pretty zany, out there things. So they talk about, the Nazis having UFOs, or something called the Bell, which was this super secret Nazi weapon that can control time, or anti-gravity technology. And so there's something called the Technical Military Museum, run by one of these treasure hunters, which has a It's very hard to describe. It's sort of like think of a cement ring, like lying flat, probably 150 feet diameter, held aloft by like 6 or 7 cement pillars. And so they claim that this was used as a rig for Nazi UFOs or like anti-gravity flying machines. And so I initially, for those who are hearing this first time, your reaction is like, that sounds crazy. I sort of was very dismissive of it. I was like, I don't need to take this seriously because what is the point of taking it seriously? Like, I'm still going to spend all this time proving that the Nazis did not have a time machine. But the more I got into the community, the more endemic these beliefs were, I found. And I felt like in order to do it justice, I had to at least understand what they were talking about, why it held such a grip on their imagination. So I spent, I would say, 6 months. And this involved watching a lot of very disturbing videos on YouTube. I hired a research assistant to read all the books I couldn't in Polish. I read a few of the books in English. I went like any of the books that cited other books. You know, I met, I would say, this guy named Igor Witkowski, who's written 49 books about anything from werewolves to secret Nazi bases in Antarctica. And so I spent an enormous amount of time, and my takeaway was that the conspiracy theories are not harmless, that they're actually could be quite dangerous, even if they seem to be about very trivial matters. And I found it to be more and more disturbing. Even something as silly, as quote unquote silly as a Nazi flying saucer is, when put into like a great historical context, ends up being, if not an attack on what I would call like the narrative of World War II, then definitely a revisionist stance, which when these things go unchecked, can be very, very dangerous.
Something just hit me when you were saying that last sentence or two. Right? On one hand, you're speaking about the danger of conspiracy theories that really in the long run don't really matter, right? Whether the Nazis were trying to develop UFOs or not doesn't really change the outcome of World War II. And yet you're almost dismissive of literal history when it comes to your family's narrative, right? If the tombstone has the wrong birthday or the wrong birthplace for your grandmother, so your stance, your family stance is, that doesn't really matter that much. What's the difference in the long run, right? One seems to matter more than the other, the way that you present them. And I'm just wondering if you could probe that a little bit more.
It's an interesting contrast. I think like the mistake in my grandmother's tombstone, I wish it was correct. Mm-hmm. But in the scheme of things, like no one's writing books about my grandmother's tombstone. But I think when we sort of have we do have these moral narratives of the war, which are not necessarily completely aligned with the historical narrative. And so you could have a lot of facts, and how someone says the war can matter a great deal. And so what the conspiracy theories were feeding, often unconsciously, were narrative of the war as a technological one, rather than one in which many millions of Jews and other people were killed at the hands of the Germans. And so you would see like the sort of the subtext in a lot of these books is one, they're like, the Germans developed incredible technology. And you're like, that is not the takeaway. And so I have a line in the book, I said, even if the Nazis actually had an actual time machine, it still would not be the most important story of World War II. And so, yeah, like the tombstone, it's, no one's writing about Bubby. And so like, it would be great if it was fixed, and it's gonna be sad when everyone who knows it's a mistake is no longer around. But I don't know what that's an interesting question, like what are the stakes?
It's an interesting answer also, thank you. I'm wondering, you mentioned in the beginning that when you first began this expedition, your family was relatively nonplussed, kind of. They were saying, if you want to go back and go visit, go right ahead, we don't really care, we already have our sense of closure, and that was more or less the end of it. I'm wondering, now that you put all this time and effort into it, and the book has already been published, and people are reading it, what's your family's reaction now after the fact?
The book, it takes, 2 or 3 hours to read the book, but it took, I would say, 5 or 6 years to sort of go through everything that happened. And so from this perspective of my family, I'd come home, every summer, or I'd spend 2-3 months a year in Poland. I'd come back and tell them the stories. And it was a hard story to understand. I would be like, something's happening with the building, I have this lawyer, I went to court, I met these treasure hunters, and everything kind of just like collapsed into Menachem's zany adventures in Poland. And so it was hard for my family to sort of understand, I would say, the story in context and like as a whole. And when the book came out, I think it was for my immediate family and my cousins, it was kind of a reintroduction to our family history.
Had they been following the story or reading like the draft as it was coming, or
No.
they read it for the first time when it was over?
There was some family-sensitive parts, which I allowed certain people to read, and we had some difficult conversations about it, and I made some changes. But no, and I I would see my cousins, they're like, what are you up to? I'm like, yeah, I'm reclaiming this building. They're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, it's complicated. And so people knew a little bit, but no one, the Avraham Kaiser story and the stuff with the treasure hunters it's long and a weird story. Mm-hmm. And so for most people, when they read the book, was really their first intro to it. And it really did restart a conversation in my family about what the legacy is of my grandfather. And it was sort of like the secondary and unexpected gift of the book to sort of, it really concretized this history and this legacy for my family.
That's really nice. When somebody who's not a member of your family reads the book, let's say any member of the congregation, after they buy their copy, after this conversation, what kinds of issues or questions, what topics or what thoughts do you want them to walk away with?
I try really not to be didactic. And so I don't know. The book's been out since March. I've done a number of events and I've heard from people all over the world, and people's takeaways are really different, which to me is really, really gratifying. And so I don't know if my only lesson, if there's a lesson at all, is that familial history is so much stranger than we give it credit. And my story, I don't even know if it's all that remarkable. It's just I've had the real special opportunity to dig really deep. Okay, and that's a bad pun, but
Mm-hmm.
and so it's just my family story just got stranger and richer because I was able to delve into it. But I think that's true for a lot of us. And so I've had the opportunity to be sitting to meet a lot of people who've done similar-ish stories. And one thing is guaranteed, that your story, sort of the closer you get, the less familiar it becomes and the richer and stranger it becomes.
So the moral of the story is really everyone has a Nazi hunter UFO somewhere in their family tree. It's just a matter of sussing it out.
They have something comparable.
It's good to hear. Can you describe some of the reactions people have come to you with about the book?
Sure. It's largely been overwhelmingly positive. I would say there's Jewish audiences and non-Jewish audiences react a little differently, by and large. I think Jewish audiences, especially American Jewish audiences, they're seeing a grappling with legacy, which is very overt. And it's the story is my story, but it's also me trying to figure out what my responsibility is in telling this story. And it's one that I really struggle with because I didn't know my grandfather and I didn't know his story. And I go through the entire book and I actually never really learn his story. And ironically, I learn a great deal about this Avraham Kaiser, and his story is really remarkable. And he becomes sort of an alternate grandfather. So I think for a lot of Jews, especially one who have, a Holocaust legacy, they sort of really are relating to that struggle. There's a small minority of people who felt alienated by that, who feel I didn't give it enough. I don't know. I don't really understand certain kind of respect. I felt they felt the fact one half of the book feels adventure-y and another half feels Holocaust memory, and some people feel that shouldn't go together. I've gotten a little bit of criticism, I would say, from Polish circles, from Polish nationalist circles, for not sort of being sufficiently sensitive to the Polish narrative, which I think is unfounded, let's say. But I think the most gratifying response has been from people from my generation. And so people whose grandparents or sometimes great-grandparents are survivors themselves, and them also being in this position of figuring out what that means in terms of what does that mean for their Holocaust legacy. And so it's not necessarily their parents, it's their grandparents, so they feel a little removed, or maybe they don't even know their grandparents, and they say they've inherited the story and are not sure what to make of it. And I have really tried to be very frank about my struggle. And so people have related to that, which has been very, very gratifying.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm going to ask you one more question, a larger picture question, and then we'll throw it to the audience, and I'm sure you've sparked some conversation topics for them as well. In the book, you talk a little bit about reparations and justice, and what right you have to this building and what that even means nowadays. Like say, for example, right, just after World War II or after the State of Israel was founded, the topic of reparations was a very, very hot, very, very real topic. Right? On one hand, that money was Jewish money. Right? Jewish communities had that money. The State of Israel needed that money. On the other hand, Menachem Begin got up in the Knesset and said, we should never take this blood money from the Germans. And that went back and forth. And you can talk about reparations, right? Whether in that context or maybe an American context or whatever. That's all like one side. On the other side, like when you get to Poland and you see this building, right? Even if you can prove definitively it's your family's building and your grandfather owned that building, you get there and you see there's another family living there. And the family's been living there for a while, and they had nothing to do with this. So that only adds another layer of complexity, right? It's what your family is owed. It's what history or justice owes your family. But it's this particular building in this particular place, which is now really part of somebody else's story. And those two kind of blend together. So I'm just wondering if you could reflect on that a little bit, just like the larger topic.
Sure. I think it's also important to make a distinction between reparations and possession. And so my claim here, my quest is not to take back anything. Mm-hmm. It is to reassert ownership. So no one owns that building now. Like it's under Polish law, it's now technically ownerless. But if you go to the sort of like the downstairs in the courthouse and pull out the book, which lists all the deeded owners stretching back to the 19th century, it's my family, the last listed one. And so I'm not taking something from someone. And so like it wasn't nationalized, wasn't taken. I'm just saying my family owned the building and therefore still owns the building, and the heirs are, everyone was murdered, and so like why should that like corrupt our ownership? Mm-hmm. So it's not reparations. So no one is like paying out. Mm-hmm. I think reparations is very complicated because you're right. At a certain point, it introduces a fungibility from money to trauma, mm-hmm. and that is a really complicated one. And so like my grandmother got a little bit of money from the German government. I don't think there was any sense of like, oh, they gave her what she was owed. Right. And it's not a debt that can be repaid. On the other, the idea of refusing it and the idea of refusing to like even enter into kind of transaction where the aggressor, in this case Germany, would say like, oh, we're doing our part. I understand the impulse to reject it. On the other hand, we don't have another mechanism. Like this is the mechanism we have, right? And so I'm not an authority. I wouldn't like speak to American reparation or what's going on in Israel. But I'm sensitive to these questions, and I think they're just really, really complicated, especially when there's like trauma and pain involved, even if that's like a trauma and pain that's been passed down.
Maybe you can say to a certain degree, kind of reasserting that ownership, or having the deed kind of reestablished in that way, is like correcting the birthplace on the tombstone.
You say for
the sake of the historical record, kind of like reasserting this is the way it is, even if your family is not moving back to Poland or doesn't expect to collect rent from the current people who are living there. It's just a matter of having the historical record perfected.
Yeah, I mean, that introduces like a sort of moral element which I don't even know is necessary. I was like, even just legally, mm-hmm. like legally it's ours. But I do want to circle back to what you said before of like adding this other layer. And to me that was really, really important because I came in sort of very narrow-minded and very focused. I was like, okay, the legal reality, the moral reality here is that my family owned the building, it still owns the building. I don't have to think about anything else. Eventually I was sort of moved off that perch and was compelled to actually visit the people in the building and began relationships with a lot of them. And I met many of them and they were like incredibly warm and open to me. And so it didn't change the legal reality. I didn't feel like my legal justification was challenged, nor did I feel like my moral justification was challenged. But I will say my consciousness expanded and another layer was added to the story because I was like, yeah, these people, many of whom have no idea about the origins of the building, my actions are going to affect them. And who am I to like pretend that they don't exist? And so like again, it's like a very fine line of sort of preserving my legal and moral rights, but also sort of bringing their reality into the picture. It's a delicate dance. And so, but what you're saying is just really important, sort of like to add these layers into the story.
Okay, Menachem, thank you so much.
Yeah.